By the time the reports were laid side by side on Allied desks, the war in Western Europe no longer appeared as a single, coherent advance, but as two parallel campaigns moving at radically different speeds, each shaped by its commander's assumptions about time, risk, and the cost of delay. On one front, formations under Montgomery were locked into a grinding struggle across tightly held ground, where every mile was purchased through deliberate set-piece attacks, heavy artillery preparation, and the slow accumulation of infantry losses that did not show up on maps but were meticulously tallied in casualty ledgers. The operational objective there was stability and control, an effort to keep pressure on German forces and deny them the freedom to maneuver, yet the price of that stability was a steady bleed of men measured not in dramatic breakthroughs but in thousands of wounded and killed recorded over successive weeks. In the same period, Patton's forces, operating along a more fluid axis, were exploiting gaps that had opened in the German line, advancing through towns and road junctions with a velocity that startled even Allied planners who had assumed the enemy would recover more quickly from earlier defeats. These were not empty movements on paper. Each town taken represented a functioning node of transport, communication, and local authority passing into Allied hands, reshaping the logistical geometry of the campaign in ways that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The contrast was not simply one of tempo but of what each commander chose to measure as success. Montgomery's headquarters received daily updates that emphasized frontage, attrition, and the maintenance of a continuous Allied line, a framework rooted in the memory of earlier wars where exposed flanks and overextended spearheads had led to catastrophe. Under that logic, a high casualty figure was not automatically a failure if it was exchanged for German losses and the preservation of a stable front. Patton, by contrast, interpreted progress through captured terrain and the dislocation of the enemy's rear, counting towns and crossings because each one reduced the distance his supply columns had to travel and increased the pressure on German command structures already strained by disrupted communications. The Allied High Command could see both sets of numbers at once: the casualty reports from Montgomery's sector and the rapidly lengthening list of liberated locations from Patton's. And what made the comparison unsettling was that both were technically positive within their own doctrinal frameworks. This duality produced a strategic tension that was difficult to articulate in briefings but impossible to ignore. The war effort depended on manpower that was not infinite, even for an alliance that drew on the industrial and demographic weight of two continents, and every 1,000 casualties represented not only human loss but also the depletion of trained units that could not be replaced quickly. At the same time, territory seized by fast-moving columns created momentum that could shorten the war by weeks or months, compressing German defenses and accelerating the collapse of their logistical systems. Maps in Allied headquarters began to show a curious pattern: a thick, immovable band of contact in Montgomery's area and long, thin arrows extending across Patton's, reaching deeper into occupied Europe. Neither told a complete story by itself, yet together they exposed a fundamental question about how victory would be achieved and at what cost. Staff officers who plotted these movements on wall charts could not escape the arithmetic behind them. 10,000 casualties in one sector meant entire battalions effectively removed from the order of battle, while a dozen captured towns in another meant supply depots, rail spurs, and road networks falling intact into Allied use. Both outcomes were real, both mattered, and neither could be dismissed without distorting the reality of the campaign. The difficulty lay in reconciling them within a single strategic narrative, because the war was being fought not by a single method but by two philosophies operating simultaneously, each generating data that pointed to a different definition of progress. In that moment, the Allied command structure was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that success could look like suffering in one place and like rapid expansion in another, and that any attempt to evaluate the campaign would have to account for both the blood being spent and the ground being gained, even when those two measures refused to align neatly. As the casualty returns from Montgomery's sector were collated and transmitted upward through the Allied reporting system, their cumulative weight began to alter the tone of discussion in headquarters rooms that had previously been dominated by maps and movement arrows rather than by lists of names. The figures did not arrive as a single shocking revelation but as a steady sequence of daily summaries, each one adding another layer to a growing ledger that now ran into the thousands, and it was precisely this gradual accumulation that made them difficult to dismiss as the normal friction of large-scale operations. Staff officers who specialized in manpower and replacement flows could see immediately what those numbers implied for the weeks ahead, because every infantry casualty represented not only a man removed from the line but a demand on training depots, transport networks, and medical facilities that were already stretched by the tempo of the campaign. When these reports were presented alongside the order of battle, they translated into battalions that would need to be reconstituted or withdrawn, divisions whose combat effectiveness was quietly slipping even as their front lines remained intact on the map. Within the Allied leadership, this reality produced a form of concern that was both technical and moral, expressed not in public statements but in the private language of memoranda and conference transcripts. Montgomery's operational area had been expected to absorb pressure, but the scale of the losses suggested a level of attrition that threatened to erode the very stability his approach was designed to preserve. Planners who tracked replacement pipelines understood that infantrymen were not interchangeable units that could be moved like trucks on a chart, because training a rifleman to operate effectively under fire required time that the campaign did not necessarily have, and the lag between loss and replacement introduced a silent vulnerability into every unit holding the line. Medical officers added their own data, reporting on the ratio of wounded to killed and the capacity of field hospitals to process the steady inflow, which in turn affected how quickly men could be returned to duty or permanently written off, further complicating the arithmetic of force strength. These discussions were not abstract. They were anchored in tables that showed, in stark columns, how many men had entered Montgomery's sector at the start of the operation and how many remained fit for duty after successive weeks of combat. When senior commanders reviewed these tables, the concern was not simply about the present but about the sustainability of the approach being used, because a strategy that consumed manpower faster than it could be replaced risked narrowing Allied options later in the campaign. Even if the front remained unbroken, a thinning line reduced flexibility, making it harder to exploit opportunities or respond to unexpected German counteractions. The leadership could see that Montgomery's method, while disciplined and methodical, was exacting a cost that was becoming increasingly visible in the internal metrics by which the war was being managed. This awareness generated a subtle shift in how Montgomery's performance was evaluated at the highest levels. Success could no longer be measured solely by whether his formations held their ground and maintained pressure, because the growing casualty totals introduced a second, less forgiving dimension to the assessment. Every planning conference that included a review of losses forced participants to confront the trade-offs embedded in the campaign, and while no one questioned Montgomery's commitment or competence, the numbers made it impossible to ignore the human and logistical price of his tactics. In the restrained language of military bureaucracy, phrases about acceptable loss rates and operational endurance began to appear, signaling a recognition that the campaign was approaching thresholds that could not be crossed without long-term consequences. What made this moment particularly uneasy was that the concern arose not from a single disaster but from the slow, cumulative effect of decisions that individually seemed reasonable. Montgomery's headquarters could justify each operation in isolation, yet the Allied leadership, looking across the entire theater, had to integrate those justifications into a broader picture that included manpower reserves, shipping schedules, and political expectations at home. As the casualty figures continued to arrive, they became more than statistics. They were indicators of a trajectory that demanded scrutiny, quietly forcing senior commanders to weigh the balance between maintaining a firm, costly front and preserving the strength needed to carry the war to its conclusion. While Montgomery's casualty tables were being reviewed with growing unease, a different set of documents was circulating through the same offices, and their tone was unmistakably more buoyant, built around place names rather than body counts and around forward movement rather than endurance. From Patton's headquarters came situation reports that showed a widening arc of captured towns, river crossings, and road junctions, each one marked by a date and time that testified to the speed with which his columns were advancing through ground that had only recently been held by German forces. These gains were not simply symbolic, because every town taken intact meant warehouses, rail sidings, and telephone exchanges now operating for the Allies, effectively compressing the distance between frontline units and the supply depots that sustained them. Quartermasters could see the implications immediately, as shorter lines of communication translated into fewer truck miles, lower fuel consumption, and a greater capacity to sustain momentum without drawing down strategic reserves. The narrative that emerged from these figures was one of efficiency and exploitation, a demonstration of how mobile forces could convert enemy dislocation into tangible operational advantage. Patton's reports emphasized the accumulation of terrain in much the same way that Montgomery's emphasized the maintenance of a continuous front, yet the psychological impact of a steadily expanding map was markedly different. Senior commanders, accustomed to years of slow, costly advances in other theaters, could not ignore the impression created by arrows that pushed deeper into occupied territory with each successive update, suggesting a kind of inevitability that was absent from static lines. When these movements were plotted against German logistics, they revealed an additional layer of significance, because every mile gained reduced the space in which German units could maneuver and increased the strain on their already fragile supply network. This created a competing framework for understanding what progress looked like, one rooted in velocity and disruption rather than in attrition and containment. Staff officers responsible for planning future operations began to consider how Patton's advances might be leveraged to outflank or destabilize German positions elsewhere, because the capture of a single transport hub could have effects far beyond its immediate tactical value. In this context, a list of 12 towns was not a mere count of flags planted but a chain of interconnected nodes that reshaped the flow of men and material across an entire sector. The fact that these gains were being achieved with comparatively lower reported casualties added to their persuasive power, even if the full accounting of losses would only become clear over time. Within the Allied leadership, this stream of data exerted a subtle but persistent pull on strategic thinking. It offered a vision of victory that was faster and, at least on paper, less expensive in human terms, a contrast that was difficult to ignore when juxtaposed with the grinding arithmetic of Montgomery's front. The tension did not arise from rivalry alone, but from the way these two sets of numbers implied different futures. One in which the war would be decided through steady pressure and another in which it might be resolved through rapid penetration and collapse. Patton's gains suggested that the German command structure was more brittle than previously assumed, and that a determined thrust, properly supplied, could unravel defenses that appeared formidable when viewed from a fixed line. As these reports were digested, they began to influence the tone of discussions about resource allocation and operational priorities, because momentum had its own logic, demanding fuel, spare parts, and replacement units to sustain itself. The faster Patton moved, the more attractive his axis of advance became as a focal point for Allied effort, not because of personal charisma, but because the maps and timelines indicated a potential shortcut through the enemy's defensive system. Yet this attractiveness also carried risk, since rapid advances could outrun their logistical base if not carefully managed, a reality that planners kept in mind even as they acknowledged the apparent success of the approach. In this way, Patton's territorial gains did more than extend the front. They introduced an alternative narrative about how the war in Western Europe might be brought to a conclusion. It was a narrative written in kilometers and captured infrastructure rather than in casualty ratios, and it forced Allied leaders to consider whether the traditional emphasis on holding and grinding down the enemy was being overtaken by a model that prioritized speed, disruption, and the exploitation of opportunity. The quiet power of that narrative lay not in rhetoric but in the steady accumulation of concrete results, each new town on the map serving as a data point that challenged existing assumptions about the most effective path forward. In London, the flow of information from the continent converged on Churchill's desk in a form that was at once orderly and quietly unsettling, with typed summaries, annotated maps, and casualty tables arriving in thick folders that demanded more than a cursory glance. He was accustomed to absorbing bad news, yet the juxtaposition of Montgomery's losses and Patton's territorial gains created a pattern that could not be reduced to a simple measure of progress, because each set of figures spoke a different language about the same war. As he read through the reports, he would have seen not only numbers but trajectories, one describing a front that was holding at significant human cost and another depicting a force that was moving rapidly through space, converting opportunity into ground that could be defended and supplied. The Prime Minister's experience from earlier campaigns had taught him that such divergences were rarely temporary, and that they often foreshadowed deeper questions about how resources, lives, and political capital were being spent. Churchill's method of processing these materials was characteristically thorough, involving marginal notes and requests for clarification that reflected his insistence on understanding not just what was happening but why. He would have noted the casualty ratios in Montgomery's sector alongside the replacement figures available from British depots, aware that every division weakened by attrition reduced the margin for error in a campaign that still had many months to run. At the same time, the reports from Patton's front offered a different set of calculations, as each captured town implied both an immediate tactical advantage and a longer-term logistical benefit, shortening supply lines and complicating German efforts to regroup. The challenge for Churchill was to integrate these two narratives into a single strategic picture that could guide Allied policy without being distorted by either optimism or despair. In the privacy of his study, the contrast between the fronts would have been particularly stark, because he could compare them without the need to maintain diplomatic balance or public morale. The British losses weighed heavily, not only because of their scale, but because they were borne by a nation that had already endured years of strain, and whose manpower reserves were finite in a way that American ones were not. Yet Churchill also understood that Patton's advances, while impressive, were being achieved by forces that depended on a continuous flow of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, a logistical lifeline that ran across the Atlantic and through vulnerable ports and rail networks. The maps showed progress, but they also hinted at fragility, and Churchill was keenly aware that overextension had undone more than one promising campaign in the past. What made the situation particularly complex was that both sets of reports could be read as evidence of success, depending on the criteria applied. Montgomery was achieving his assigned task of fixing German forces in place, preventing them from redeploying against more mobile Allied units, even as his casualty figures climbed. Patton, meanwhile, was exploiting that very fixation to drive deeper into enemy-held territory, creating the appearance of a breakthrough that could, under the right conditions, become decisive. Churchill's role was not to choose between these narratives but to understand how they interacted, because the fate of the campaign depended on their combined effect rather than on either one in isolation. As he processed the documents, Churchill would have been mindful of the political implications as well, knowing that high casualties among British units would reverberate in Parliament and among a public already fatigued by years of war. At the same time, rapid American gains could shift the balance of influence within the alliance, subtly altering how decisions were made and whose preferences carried the greatest weight. These considerations did not appear in the official reports, yet they hovered over every line of text, shaping the way the Prime Minister interpreted what he read. For Churchill, strategy was never purely military. It was an intricate blend of battlefield realities, industrial capacity, and the endurance of the societies that sustained them. By the time he set the papers aside, he would have formed a provisional understanding of where the campaign stood, one that acknowledged both the promise of Patton's momentum and the sobering cost of Montgomery's persistence. The opposing reports did not cancel each other out. Instead, they created a tension that demanded careful management, because the war could not be won by speed alone nor by sacrifice without limit. In that moment, Churchill's task was to hold these competing truths in balance, recognizing that the outcome would be shaped as much by the decisions made in London as by the movements recorded on distant maps. When Churchill finally put his assessment into words, they carried the weight of a man who had spent a lifetime watching wars drift away from their original promises, and his language reflected a calculation that went beyond immediate headlines or short-term morale. He did not speak in abstractions about courage or endurance, because the documents in front of him had already translated those virtues into columns of losses and columns of gains, and it was in the disparity between those columns that his judgment took shape. The British formations under Montgomery were paying a price that could be measured in battalions reduced to cadres and in casualty ratios that climbed with each passing week, while elsewhere Allied forces were converting movement into concrete advantage at a pace that made the static attrition seem increasingly difficult to justify. Churchill's words, whether recorded in notes or conveyed in conversation, reflected an awareness that sacrifice only retained its moral legitimacy when it was visibly linked to progress, and that without that link it risked becoming a form of strategic waste. This was not a criticism of Montgomery's personal resolve, which Churchill respected, but a reflection on the structure of the campaign as it was unfolding. The Prime Minister understood that no army could avoid losses, yet he also understood that the British Army, in particular, did not possess an unlimited reservoir of trained manpower, and that each casualty therefore carried a weight disproportionate to its place in a ledger. In his view, an operation that consumed thousands of men to hold ground that did not translate into broader strategic advantage raised questions that could not be dismissed as the inevitable cost of war. By contrast, Patton's advances, though not without risk, were producing a visible compression of the enemy's strategic depth, a kind of progress that could be traced on a map and felt in the shortening of supply lines and the disruption of German administration. Churchill's language was shaped by this contrast, and it revealed a mind trying to reconcile the ethical and the practical dimensions of command. He was acutely aware that British soldiers were dying in large numbers in order to maintain a front whose value was increasingly defined by its relationship to more dynamic operations elsewhere. This did not make their sacrifice meaningless, but it did force a re-examination of whether the balance between cost and return was being properly maintained. In a war that was already straining Britain's economic and social fabric, the Prime Minister could not ignore the implications of an approach that traded lives for incremental positional gains, especially when those gains did not appear to accelerate the overall collapse of the enemy. At the same time, Churchill was careful not to romanticize speed or movement for their own sake. His experience in earlier conflicts had taught him that rapid advances could conceal vulnerabilities, particularly when logistics lagged behind ambition. Yet even with this caution, he could see that Patton's pattern of progress suggested a more favorable ratio between expenditure and result, one in which each unit of effort produced a disproportionate effect on the enemy's ability to sustain resistance. In this light, Churchill's words were not an endorsement of recklessness but an appeal for a strategic economy of force, a principle that sought to maximize the impact of every ton of fuel, every shell, and every soldier committed to the fight. The imbalance he perceived was therefore not merely numerical but conceptual. It lay between a method that emphasized endurance at high cost and one that emphasized exploitation at potentially lower cost, and Churchill's judgment reflected his belief that the latter, when properly supported, offered a more sustainable path to victory. His remarks were grounded in the hard reality that wars are ultimately decided by the side that can align its sacrifices with tangible gains, maintaining public and political support while steadily eroding the enemy's capacity to continue. When that alignment falters, even the most disciplined armies begin to operate under a shadow of doubt. In expressing his view, Churchill was articulating a quiet but profound reckoning about the nature of Allied strategy at that moment. He was not diminishing the courage of those holding the line, nor was he dismissing the necessity of their role, but he was insisting that their losses had to be justified by outcomes that moved the war toward a decisive conclusion. His words captured a tension that ran through the entire Allied effort, a tension between the grim arithmetic of sacrifice and the imperative of progress, and in doing so they revealed a leader striving to ensure that the blood being shed was not merely sustaining the present but actively shaping a future in which the war would finally end. After Churchill's judgment entered the record, it did not resolve the underlying tension so much as deepen it, because words spoken at that level carried an authority that could not be ignored, even when they were not accompanied by explicit orders. Within the Allied command structure, such remarks functioned as a signal, quietly altering how senior officers interpreted their own positions and the degree of confidence that London placed in their methods. Montgomery's headquarters would have been aware that the Prime Minister's patience was not unlimited, and that continued high losses without corresponding territorial or strategic payoff would inevitably sharpen scrutiny, creating a subtle pressure to justify every operational decision in terms that extended beyond immediate tactical necessity. Patton's staff, in contrast, could sense that momentum was being read as competence, that movement across the map was not merely a military achievement but a form of political capital that reinforced faith in his approach. This shift in perception did not produce immediate changes on the ground, but it reshaped the psychological environment in which those changes would eventually be considered. Commanders do not operate in a vacuum, and the knowledge that the highest civilian authority was weighing sacrifice against progress introduced a layer of accountability that went beyond formal reporting channels. For Montgomery, it meant that his carefully constructed model of attritional stability was now being evaluated not only on its internal logic but on how it compared, implicitly and unavoidably, with a more dynamic alternative. For Patton, it meant that his rapid gains carried an added burden, because expectations tend to rise in proportion to success, and the very narrative that favored him also made any future slowdown more conspicuous. At the strategic level, Churchill's words reinforced an ongoing recalibration of priorities, one that balanced the need to keep German forces engaged against the opportunity to exploit their weaknesses. Planners in London and at Allied headquarters were forced to consider whether the existing distribution of resources, from fuel allocations to replacement troops, truly reflected the most effective use of Allied strength. A front that absorbed large numbers of men and material to maintain its position could still be necessary, but its justification now had to be framed within a broader vision of how the war would be brought to an end, not simply how it would be sustained. This subtle but powerful reframing made every logistical decision a potential referendum on strategic direction, because each convoy diverted or reinforced carried implications about which approach was being privileged. The resonance of Churchill's statement lay in its ambiguity, which allowed it to influence thinking without constraining it. He had not issued a directive, but he had articulated a concern that could be applied to any future development, turning casualty figures and territorial gains into indicators of confidence or doubt. In this environment, numbers took on an added layer of meaning, becoming not just measures of performance but signals of how leadership was perceived. A rise in losses without visible progress could erode trust, while a steady advance, even if modest, could sustain it, and this dynamic operated quietly in the background of every briefing and situation report. For the men at the top of the Allied hierarchy, this created a climate in which strategic choices were increasingly intertwined with questions of credibility. A commander's ability to maintain the confidence of political leaders depended not only on professional competence but on the narrative that his operations generated, a narrative that Churchill's words had subtly reshaped. The war effort required unity, yet unity did not preclude comparison, and the implicit contrast between sacrifice and progress introduced a competitive element into the evaluation of Allied operations, one that could motivate innovation or provoke defensiveness, depending on how it was received. In this way, the implications of Churchill's statement extended far beyond the moment in which it was spoken. It lingered in the calculations of planners, in the self-assessments of commanders, and in the allocation of resources that would determine how the campaign unfolded. Without prescribing a single course of action, it underscored a fundamental truth about modern warfare, that leadership is judged not only by endurance but by the ability to convert that endurance into results that justify its cost. The quiet power of those words lay in their capacity to make that truth unavoidable, leaving it to resonate within the Allied command structure as a reminder that confidence and direction, once called into question, must be continually earned through the hard evidence of what a campaign achieves.